Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the Direct Entry Program SIG's first webinar for 2020. My name is Will Alderson, and I'm the convener for the SIG and also the Director of Studies at CQ University's campus in Melbourne. So the webinar today will be looking at the topic of the balancing of academic skills and academic language proficiency in direct entry programs. So the idea for this webinar grew out of conversations that we had at our pre-conference session last year in September. Attendees were asked to discuss how they designed the learning outcomes for their direct entry programs and what assessment tools they used to measure their students' performance. And it was really interesting that there were a number of different approaches being used in this sense. And so we thought it would be really useful to look at a couple of cases in a bit more depth and hopefully generate a bit of discussion on the topic. So we're really fortunate to have two guest speakers who've given up their time to prepare a short presentation for us. We've got Brooke Donnelly, who is the Education Manager for University Pathways at the Centre for English Teaching at the University of Sydney, and also Stephen Walker, who is the Academic Manager for Assessment at ICT-UQ at the University of Queensland. So Brooke and Stephen will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and after that we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions. You'll be able to post questions throughout the webinar, so if something pops into your mind, feel free to send through the questions straight away so you don't forget it, and I'll pass them on at the end. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Brooke and Stephen.
Okay, hello. All good to go. Hello, everyone. I'm Brooke, as Will said. My initial response to this topic when I was first approached to talk about this was that there really shouldn't be a problem of balance between academic skills and academic language proficiency, because the two are actually wholly interrelated and two sides of the same coin. The academic skills actually comprise the activities or the context within which the language use occurs. And if we're here discussing this problem, because it's clearly a problem with so much interest, of this balance, then it points, I think, to there being contextual factors in our direct entry programs that are impacting on what I think should be a naturally harmonious relationship. And in fact, speaking to Stephen, who will talk after me today about this topic before the webinar, it became apparent that our respective institutions, in the face of, I think, very similar contextual factors, have responded in quite different ways, and I think that you'll find that an interesting discussion today. Oh, the slide. Okay, so I'm going to start first actually by defining what exactly we mean by academic skills, because as I've already said, I think that this is the context within which the academic language use takes place. But defining academic skills is in itself problematic, because what we know now with the advent of corpora and developments in research in EAP is that there are significant differences between the disciplines in how knowledge is constructed and how language is used in that context and in that construction. And for this reason, there's actually a very strong argument in the literature for EAP programs to address specific disciplinary varieties of academic discourse. And the concept of academic literacies is useful here. I'll give you a definition. This is from Wingate. That academic literacy is the ability to communicate competently in an academic discourse community. This encompasses reading, evaluating information, as well as presenting, debating, and creating knowledge through both speaking and writing. These capabilities require knowledge of the community's epistemology, of the genres through which the community interacts, and of the conventions that regulate these interactions. And so this concept, I think, of academic literacies is very useful because it addresses clearly what the literature tells us and what we know implicitly, I think, as EAP practitioners. and that is that it's not only language proficiency that our students need to be successful in academic study. There needs to be a process of acculturation in specific skills, strategies, social practices to communicate effectively in a specific academic community, and therefore we should be teaching language in the context of those specific disciplinary skills, strategies and practices. But the problem, I think, for many of us in direct entry programs is that despite what the literature tells us, we're not embedded within disciplinary contexts. We're pre-entry and we generally have multidisciplinary cohorts. Certainly at CET, we have multidisciplinary classes. We stream them for a number of weeks, but even within those streams, there's still huge variety in the target disciplines. The teachers are not subject specialists. They're not versed in the epistemological and linguistic features of the disciplines for the most part. And so for these reasons, it's obviously very difficult for a general purposes direct entry EAP program to address academic literacies in any real disciplinary contextual sense. So with this constraint, of course, what most of us are doing in a direct entry EAP program is focus on what's sometimes called a common core of generic academic skills that we see as transferable from one academic context to another and necessary for participation and learning in content-based courses. Now, this is often termed a study skills approach, but I would argue that what we actually do is more than that. Study skills is also relevant to, for example, native speaking students who may need support with adjusting to an academic environment. In fact, what we are doing, I would say, is ESP, English for Specific Purposes, and we can define an ESP course as a course in which the content and aims are focused on the language, skills, genres, etc., appropriate to the specific activities that the learners need to carry out in English. My slides are not going. Okay, there it is. And so if we look then at these kinds of skills that you can see here that are often included in an EAP program or that you'll find in frameworks that try to explicate these kinds of skills, like the Balliap Can-Do framework, which many of you are probably familiar with. If we're taking an ESP approach, then all of these skills are the specific activities that our learners need to carry out in English. And these skills are the context for the academic language use. And so even though these skills here can and do take on a specific disciplinary character, they're characteristic of an academic context more broadly. And therefore, our curriculum and assessment task design should reflect the use of language within the context of these activities. So if we take academic writing as an example, it's actually the end product of a long literacy process that involves identifying relevant sources, evaluating the sources for relevant information, consideration of multiple perspectives, synthesizing the information into a logical argument, and presenting the argument in a logical and coherent manner. The written product is just actually the end point of that long literacy process. Now, you'll see here that I have not included critical thinking as a separate skill, as you'll often find in EAP curricula or in these sorts of taxonomies of these kinds of skills. And that's because I'd argue that the criticality is involved at every step of the process. So if you take our academic writing example, the criticality is part of every step of that process of academic writing. And so if we actually want to create the opportunity for our students to engage in the process of doing these activities, of doing academic skills, and not just focus on the product, then we need to create space for depth of critical engagement with the issues and with the topics, because the activities that we term academic skills implicitly require criticality. But what happens, I think, too often in our classrooms and in our assessment is that we are focused only on the end product, and the whole process, the whole context for the written and spoken product are dealt with only superficially in the classroom. And then we end up with this sort of tension between the skills or the process and the product, because we're focused on the product and not really creating the space for the context within which that is produced. If we have appropriately designed curriculum tasks, assessment instruments, and so on. The academic language and the academic skills should be aligned, and I think that we probably wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation about finding the balance between academic skills and academic language proficiency. The idea of having to find a balance implies that the language proficiency and the skills are actually separate and competing, when in fact they are not, I think. And I would argue that the problem of balance is because the assessment instruments that we use are not aligned appropriately with the context, and that the washback from this creates the problem of balance between academic language proficiency and academic skills in the curriculum and in teaching and learning. It's basically a problem of constructive alignment. This is the way we treated it here at CET, because the assessment instruments that we have available to us, or had available to us, don't capture actually the academic skills outcomes that we want to achieve from the program. However, one of the great constraints that we do have in direct entry contexts is this institutional and regulatory requirement for comparability. The testing is so high stakes, it must be valid, reliable, consistent, fair, clearly referenced to criteria, all of those things. And for this reason, I think much of the testing that's in place in direct entry EAP programs is modelled on the big tests. The field is dominated by a few big tests. But the problem with the big tests is that they certainly can be criticised for not adequately capturing the academic skills component. And I think if you ask any EAP teacher, they'll tell you that the students have generally had years of test practice. They're great at test taking, but it hasn't given them the skills that they need for example, synthesis and evaluation, and for research, for extended writing or speaking, and all of those activities within which they need to use the academic language. And certainly this was the case here at CET, and still is to some extent. We had a proficiency testing model, benchmarked to IELTS, extensively benchmarked to IELTS, and though this has changed a little, the washback was problematic in terms of achieving our desired course outcomes. So what are our desired course outcomes at CET? We've basically worked towards outcomes in three broad areas that you can see there. Not only the academic language proficiency, but the critical literacy and a digital literacy competency. I've talked a bit about the critical competency. I'm not going to talk a lot about the digital today, but if we model how these outcomes work together, the activities that we've already discussed that comprise the academic skills, this is where the outcomes are manifested, if you like, where they interact with each other. So the academic skills are the context where the students actually do the critical and the digital and use the academic language. Slide. Okay, but because of the summative assessment model that we had and still partly have, the washback from this meant that what was actually happening in teaching and learning was that, first of all, the skills development was quite siloed. There was no real integration of skills for the most part. They didn't feed into and extend on each other. Reading and listening instruction particularly were focused on engaging with the text at the level of doing testing comprehension items rather than engaging with text for academic purposes, i.e. critically engaging with the text to identify and evaluate information and to synthesize and organize and use that information for specific writing and speaking purposes. The proficiency model also meant that every week there was a new topic of a general knowledge nature. There were also prescriptive text types for writing tasks. So rather than encouraging the students to consider how the information that they have to hand from sources might best be presented in a logical and coherent way, they were kind of encouraged to squeeze that into a pre-specified format. And basically, because of this lack of academic skills context and lack of critical depth, critical thinking ended up being taught as an add-on, as a separate topic, rather than as part of the whole process of doing the language and doing the skills. Sorry, I'm struggling a little with the slides. So what was actually happening in terms of our outcomes that we want to achieve with that sort of washback was that the academic skills and the criticality were fundamentally limited. They were essentially de-emphasised and not really tied into the language development, because they were treated essentially as something separate to the language skills, because the focus was, in a sense, more on test-taking activities. But we're basically stuck, in a sense, with some of this assessment model. The reading and listening tests that we have a battery of reading and listening tests which have been developed over years, which are valid, which are reliable, which we know equate to IELTS scores because we choose to benchmark to IELTS. We have a little bit more flexibility with the productive skills tasks. So we couldn't change the assessment battery in itself too much. So we basically attacked this problem at two levels. And the first was in curriculum by redesigning the teaching and learning cycles. And the second was in measurement by redesigning and developing rubrics for productive skills tasks that aim to capture some of those processes that I've been talking about. Now that is also difficult, but we'll get to that point. Okay, so a bit of context first. The direct entry program at CET runs for a maximum of 36 weeks across 4 different levels, but these levels do not run ever at the same time. The whole 36-week program runs twice a year and is timed to finish with semester 1 or semester 2 entry, and as students come in at subsequent levels, they simply join the existing cohort. Now I'm just going to focus here on the final 15 weeks of the program, because this is where the vast majority of the students join us. The bulk of them do the 15 weeks, and then some more will join in for that final 10-week program. So we attacked the problem in some senses at this part of the program. So to address this kind of tension, if you like, between the proficiency testing sort of end point and creating the curriculum space for depth of engagement and development of academic skills and the achievement of our desired outcomes, instead of running a 5-week course and a 10-week course, which is what we used to do, we unpacked the end of the course into 3 5-week modules. The first 2 of these modules are focused very deliberately on the development of academic language in the context of depth of critical engagement and academic skills, and we work on 5-week themes to create that space. The final assessment module very deliberately focuses on teacher-guided test preparation so that the students have a few weeks of intensive preparation for the testing that's going to decide whether they get into university or not. And so you can see we very deliberately separated out the academic skills development and the test preparation in teaching and learning, though there is some overlap. So what does that actually look like for teaching and learning in the classroom? Okay, so for those 2 5-week academic skills modules, the 5 weeks at 20 hours a week gives the students much the same level of content that a student would probably get in a unit of study over a semester in terms of depth, and allows the students to engage in extended reading, research, writing and speaking tasks around the theme. These academic skills modules, the students engage in extended writing assignments over 4 weeks. These extended writing assignments, research and writing, are also associated with presentation or seminar tasks, and there's extended engagement with the topic and with the core text in order to produce the artefacts. The approach that we've taken in these academic skills modules is much more of a literacy approach. So we've drawn extensively on the literature around reading to write, particularly in order to build the classroom material and the lessons. And so the focus in the reading to write approach in the classroom is really on engaging with the text to understand the information structures, to identify information relevant to purpose, to evaluate that information, take notes, organise information, and so on before an output task. So to do these output tasks, the students are required, they need to use the core texts. There are core texts in these modules, in addition to a couple of their own sources, but mostly they need to use the core text. There's guided note-taking and drafting, so that the teachers are much better placed to actually guide and help the students with the process of collecting the information, synthesising the information, summarising, paraphrasing for specific purpose, rather than decontextualised practice of those skills. And so in this way, we've created the context for the students to actually engage in depth in authentic academic tasks, and for the teachers to guide them through that whole process that leads up to the output task, so that the students can develop their language in the context of using and developing the academic skills. But the key for us to creating that space in the classroom is that we've basically kicked out the reading and listening test preparation comprehension style questions. We've kicked that out of this classroom entirely and into online adaptive modules. So within the classes in those academic skills modules, there are none of those testing comprehension type items that we're all familiar with. The students still need, however, to have practice in that, because that's the test format that's ultimately going to decide if they go to university or not. But we decided that this can be handled quite adequately by the online platforms, because the answers are predictable, the feedback is predictable, all of it can be programmed in, and we feed the performance data then back to the teachers, who can intervene where they see fit with any problematic items. So by doing this, the teacher and the classroom have been freed up to focus on that sort of more organic, responsive kind of learning around academic literacy practices, if you like, and the development of the academic skills. This was, interestingly though, actually challenging, very challenging initially for some teachers, because once you take away the IELTS style test preparation questions, it involved a bit of a process of training and re-education, because what am I going to do, was the response from some of them. This is in, oh, there it is, contrast. Okay, so the academic skills modules, that's the focus, that's what we do. We've taken the focus away from the test prep, and then in that final 5 weeks, we basically funnel them into an intensive test preparation sort of format. So the themes are weekly, changing every week, so that to prepare the students for the possibility of any topic they might get in the proficiency tests. The reading and listening test comprehension style items come back into the classroom, so that the students get teacher guided practice in how to handle different question types, etc. The writing and speaking assessment are integrated tasks, so we've made the decision to sort of remain true to context and purpose in terms of writing and speaking. So the students do need to read and or listen and respond to input in those writing and speaking tasks. But in that test preparation module, obviously the process is a bit different, because to ensure the integrity of the test, this needs to be timed, it needs to be closed circuit. The students cannot have seen the text that they need to respond to prior to the task. And so this creates a very different kind of teaching and learning environment to what's going on in the academic skills modules. Now, because we've still got the integrated testing for the productive skills, we've had to, oops, make it back there. What we've tried to do, and we've put a lot of time and resources into doing this, is developing rubrics that try to capture some of these processes that are involved in the output task. So all of our rubrics for speaking and writing have 5 criteria, and 3 of those criteria are to do with the language proficiency, so with grammar or with vocabulary, text organisation, etc. But all of them also include another 2 criteria, which are something like content relevance and use of sources. And you can see here that It may be a little hard to read, but if you dig into it, I've just included the content and relevance and use of sources there for you from the final written assessment task that the students do. And if you look at that, you'll see that what that's trying to capture is that process of identifying and extracting relevant information from the source text, organising that information and synthesising that information into a logical and coherent text. Now, obviously, using rubrics like this requires a huge amount of standardisation. So we have an assessment working group whose sole purpose really for existence, I shouldn't say sole purpose for existence, but one of their core tasks is to make sure that teachers are standardised around this, and we devolve this also into marking teams with more experienced teachers who then run second mini standardisation sessions in order to make sure that we're keeping the results that are given on this as standardised as possible and obviously comparable to the big tests, which is ultimately what we need to do. So that's more or less, in a very brief summary, how we've tried to attack the balance here at CET between the skills and the academic language proficiency. And basically that's been by, in curriculum and in teaching and learning, separating them out and making the space for the academic skills, which is kind of precluded, as I said, by the nature of the assessment that we use. And also, as I've said, by trying to capture some of that process with the integrated tasks in the rubrics that we have developed. It's not a perfect science, but watch this space. And I will now hand over to Stephen.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Brooke. That was great. So, as Brooke mentioned, we did speak a couple of times before the webinar, and that was very interesting, learning about one another's contexts. And as she also said at the beginning, there are some similarities that we share, but there are certainly some areas where we have diverged and taken a different approach. And what I think was particularly interesting to me was that in some ways we have moved from perhaps being where our CET is now. In some senses, we've moved away from that. Anyway, let me talk about what we do and why we do it, starting off with why we do what we do. So I think the overarching framework for the approach we've taken is one that's best summed up probably in the work of Neil Murray and his 2015 book shown there brings together some of the work that he started when he was working at the University of South Australia. And as Brooke mentioned, he talks about English language proficiency and also academic literacies and also professional communication skills as being three parts of proficiency that students need in order to succeed in their studies and then succeed in the workplace beyond their studies. So to just define what Murray means by these things, language proficiency is one that I'm sure is very familiar to all of us, based on models by people like Himes and Bachman. And Murray believes that this is an investment in language which students can cash in any potential context of use. So this is not just academic language ability, it's also interactional and social language. But he thinks that without this kind of threshold of language, students, especially non-English speaking background students, may feel peripheral, isolated, unfulfilled, unable to join into that academic community in a meaningful way. He also feels that that English language proficiency, or this threshold ability, is a prerequisite to going on to be able to develop academic literacy and professional communication skills. Now, our remit here at the University of Queensland was only ever to admit students into university courses with English language proficiency comparable to other pathways into the university. And that's still the focus that we receive from UQ. So Pamela Humphreys, in her PhD thesis, in summing up the views about this, found that there was general agreement that language certainly does play a role, not necessarily a dominant role in academic success, once a minimum threshold of adequate proficiency has been reached. Now, of course, we could discuss what that minimum threshold might be, but our institutions have largely set that for the different courses. And then after that threshold has been reached, it's non-linguistic characteristics, things like cognitive and affective factors, that determine success or otherwise. When he defines academic literacy or literacies, Murray, very similarly to the definition that Brooke gave, talks about students being conversant in a set of literacy practices that are relevant to their discipline-specific area. It includes things like specialised vocabularies, patterns of meaning making, such as genres, rhetorical structures, argument formulations, narrative devices, and ways of contesting meaning. Or, as one of my colleagues explains it, becoming part of your community of practice. Murray makes the important distinction that these are pluralistic, so there's not one academic literacy, there are multiple academic literacies, and they can vary even within faculties. Expectations for behaviour within linguistic behaviour within particular faculties can vary quite a lot. And Murray adds that few students, whether they be domestic or international students, will enter the university with those skills already in hand. And others, and again there seems to be general agreement here, that the teaching of academic literacies should be somehow embedded in the mainstream curriculum so that all students benefit from that tuition and learning. So Murray emphasises that it's this fundamental link with disciplines that distinguishes an academic literacies model from a study skills approach, or an academic skills approach, you might say, which tends to assume that literacy is a set of itemised skills which students can learn and then transfer. So this is one place where Brooke and I probably diverge. This one-size-fits-all view tends to dislocate those academic literacies from the subject matter, which is what makes them particular to that discipline area. And then Murray goes on and lists quite a lot of things here, which I'm sure we would find very familiar in many of our direct entry programs and certainly EAP programs. Things like active and effective reading, voice in academic discourse, plagiarism, referencing conventions and paraphrase. And Murray's view here is that while some of these things like editing, proofreading, study habits, might lend themselves to a generic kind of approach, others, and he particularly singles out things like reporting research, referencing conventions, and particularly writing genres, may not. And the third level in Murray's framework there was professional communication skills. And I won't say much about that other than it's the skills and strategies that you need to communicate effectively in the workplace, so with your peers, but also with whomever it is you come into contact in your workplace. And I'll have something to say about that later. And I would add that most of our institutions probably have graduate attributes, and they probably list things like this as graduate attributes. So Brooke mentioned that it is generally agreed in the literature that the best place to be learning academic literacies is in the disciplines themselves. And that's the framework that we've tried to pursue here at the University of Queensland. So when we look at some advertising material for our direct entry program, the Bridging English course, you'll see that it's a lot to do with English language proficiency. In an academic context, sure, but these are the kinds of things that we focus on throughout our course. Just waiting for my slide. However, we also build into the course, although we don't assess it, some of the things that Brooke mentioned were a part of the course there down at CET. And the way these work is that as the students move through the course and they're working on a particular area that lends itself to further exploitation, they're directed towards online study modules. These are not hurdles within the course, so students are not penalised for not doing these things, although they're definitely encouraged to follow them up. We do have metrics, and so we could easily make them a hurdle for the course if we chose to, but we don't do that. And one of the reasons for this, I'll go back to that original remit. The university has been very clear to us that what they want from us are students whose English language proficiency we can be directly compared to students coming in via other pathways. And they want as many of those students as they can possibly have. And therefore, in the core program that we offer, we feel that in order to assist as many students as possible in reaching what is really just the beginning of their opportunity to continue to develop their English language proficiency, academic literacy, and professional communication skills, to help as many students reach that starting point as possible, we need to focus all of our attention in the direct entry program on building that English language proficiency, that general English language proficiency. However, as I've already said at the beginning, we do, within that framework, think that it's important to help students once they've passed this particular hurdle on our direct entry program, and they then have a number of years of study ahead of them within our university. We then think, well, how can we help them now that they are streamed into their discipline-specific area? How can we continue to help them to develop in those ways so that they may exit their program with those graduate attributes that the university is interested in? And so we have been developing a number of support programs for students once they have moved through the direct entry pathway. Here's a selection of those programs, and for example, if we were to have a look at this one over here, it's for a dentistry course, and for example, two things that I know that are included in this particular program. There is a writing genre. The students have to be able to write a reflective reflective report, which reflects on the development that they're making in their practice. And this is a new genre, I would say, not only for the NESB students, but also for the domestic students as well. And so the course focuses on producing that particular specific genre within that discipline of study. Similarly, particularly for NESB students, there's the clinical practice aspect of the dentistry program. And that's when they need to be able to speak both to their peers or their supervisors about the work that they're doing in an appropriate way. So that's the professional competence that we saw back within Murray's model, but also to speak with their patients and to understand what their patients are saying. And that's another component of that professional spoken language proficiency that is discipline specific in that particular case. And all of these programs have examples of that kind of academic literacy focus. This course is one that has been around for a long time, and in fact predates many of the changes that we've made to our direct entry program over the last 7 or 8 years. And this is a course that is open to students post-entry. So this is not pre-entry. So either the students have passed through our direct entry program and are now UQ students, or they're students who are entering the university via any of those other means that I've referred to. So this is open to all students. And this is probably the closest thing we have that approaches that kind of academic skills, general study skills, the idea of doing things in a generic sense that will potentially transfer. So in some senses, a course like this, I'd have to concede, goes against the kind of model that we have put forward. So for example, we're not teaching this necessarily in the disciplines, although the teachers would be able to respond to individual students' requests to look at work as it relates to their course of study that they're undertaking. But certainly this involves things like synthesis that we've talked about previously, giving oral presentations, participating in tutorial discussions, but it's not pre-entry, it's post-entry. So it's concurrent support, as the previous examples were as well. Okay, the other part of the context within we've very much had to work is that I mentioned that the university is very interested in our institution being able to provide students into different courses with English language proficiency that is comparable to other pathways. And there are the other pathways, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And here's the Bridging English result that a student would need to attain if they were entering a UQ minimum entry program. And I'm sure that that kind of minimum entry program is one with which you're very familiar. Now, the university also has similar tables to this, which deal with higher than minimum entry requirements. And so there are probably about half a dozen more of these tables. And in each case, the Bridging English program is asked to be able to say what result a student would need to attain in order to be granted entry into that UQ program. Brooke, so I forgot to click on my slide earlier. So we've got grades in the Bridging English program that match the required sub-skill bands and overall band. And of course, the other thing which is a regulatory constraint that we all need to work within is that we need to be able to show comparability between the students that we're admitting to those different courses with different entrance requirements and students entering via other means, and specifically those standardised tests. Now, Brooke mentioned that standardised testing very often doesn't focus on academic literacies or academic skills. Now, it would potentially be possible to build discipline-specific kinds of assessments, and it's one thing that Neil Murray discusses in his work. But the problem is that the variety of assessments required would be enormous. What does happen, and what we do here at UQ, is that we undertake some post-entry language assessment, or PELAs, and some of the EAC programs, which I showed earlier, such as the dentistry one that we spoke about. We can use post-entry language assessments, which are tailored to discipline-specific requirements, to try to identify students who we feel would most benefit from those concurrent support programs. However, getting back to this particular institution and what it is that we need to be able to demonstrate, both to the university itself and to organisations such as TEQSA, this has certainly been a constraint. And I think that we, before TEQSA came out with this ELICOS standard, we were very cognizant of what kind of assessment can we make that we can objectively demonstrate is directly comparable. And for those of you who have been to the assessment symposiums that we've held here over the last couple of years, you may remember Barry O'Sullivan talking about the difficulty of, or in Barry's words, the absolute lunacy, I think he said, of trying to compare assessments that just don't set out to measure the same kinds of things. I think Barry's example was one of comparing the speaking assessment in the PTEA with a test such as the IELTS or the TOEFL test. But nevertheless, we were cognizant that the kinds of assessments that we could make and we could confidently demonstrate were able to show that kind of comparability at those different levels was certainly a constraining factor. So when it came to designing assessments for our direct entry program, we are particularly fortunate, and I would think that we're possibly unique in the fact that we do happen to have a team of item writers who have, through circumstance, received training over many years and are very skillful at developing the kind of assessment items which can be used to measure reading, listening, writing skills in academic contexts. And so that has been a very, very useful asset that pure circumstance has delivered to us here within this centre. We're also able to use statistical methods such as Rash measurement so that when we assess things like productive skills, yes, we try to standardise our raters, and like Brooke explained, we do a lot in that regard, but we're also able to use things like Rash measurement to just look exactly at how our raters are performing and to feed back to them in terms of their performance, and most importantly to adjust their scores in real time so that the students are receiving fair scores from the raters that we have standardised. And finally, we've put a lot of effort, as I said, into developing that ability to demonstrate objectively that students who are entering UQ via our direct entry program do have English language proficiency, which is directly comparable to students who enter via other means. And focusing on English language proficiency, the first tier in that framework, which I began my presentation, is really crucial for us in being able to do that. We've looked at other forms of assessment, and for instance, Brooke talked about a reading into writing format, and that's certainly something that we're interested in doing, but the validation model for that kind of assessment is a more challenging one, and we're not really able to do that with confidence at this time. It doesn't mean that we're not interested in working in that direction, but at this time it's not something that we feel confident that we can do. So the Bridging English assessment, because it's an English language proficiency focused direct entry program, it has formative assessment throughout it, and really that's about teachers giving feedback. There are weekly review tests that focus on reading and listening skills and use of English. There are weekly writing tasks, feedbacks given to students on those throughout the course, and they're directed towards resources which might help them improve. We try and identify where it is they need to be spending their time and help them in that way. But the bulk of the assessment is summative. And the reason for that is, as we're focused on proficiency development, we want the students to have the maximum amount of time in which to develop that proficiency, and we want to measure it at the end. We measure it twice because there's a standard error of measurement associated with every assessment, and by measuring it twice, it enables us to minimise that error. Our speaking assessment is a test, not an oral presentation, not a tutorial discussion, but a speaking test. And I began by saying that in some senses we've moved away from perhaps where Brooks Institution is now in some senses, and perhaps one of those ways is that we did used to include things like oral presentation and tutorial discussions in our assessments, but again we found it was a narrow construct. It wasn't a broad enough proficiency construct for us to be able to make that comparison with other measures reliably, and therefore we moved to a format like this. It's a paired interview, and again, using rush measurement, we feel that we're able to control for rater effects in that aspect of our measurement. So the framework which I began with and the measurement constraints which we felt we needed to be able to achieve are certainly two of the key factors that have gone into the design of both what we teach, what we include, and how we assess that. Thank you very much. I've got 2 pages of references, so I'll let one stay there for a second and then I'll pop the other one up.
Okay, thanks for that, Stephen. Really interesting, and thanks also to Brooke at the beginning there. We haven't got many questions coming through. I've just got a couple here, so I might start off, and if we've got any more questions, please type them in there. We've got about 5 minutes. I've just got a question for Stephen to begin with. It's a really interesting approach that you take at ICT. Just wondering, what would be the difference between an IELTS preparation course of a similar length to your bridging course? What would be the difference between that and your bridging course from the student's perspective?
Well, I guess that it depends what we mean by an IELTS preparation course. If we're talking about improving the students' English language proficiency, then I don't suppose there'd be a lot of difference. But if we're talking about a test preparation course where you're focusing on test-taking strategies, that kind of thing, our course is focused on building language proficiency.
Okay, great, thanks. I've just got another one coming through. Just one more quick question for Stephen while I read this one. With your study modules, you showed the grid of the QR codes there.
Yep.
You said they weren't assessed and they weren't compulsory. Just wondering roughly sort of what percentage of students enrolled in your course do go on and do those modules, and are any of them more popular than any others?
So what we found there is that they are pegged to the course, and so particular ones are associated with particular lessons or series of lessons. And what we've noticed there is that some teachers do manage to get very high take up amongst their students because they obviously emphasise in their view, the importance of doing them, and other teachers have take up. And one reason for that may simply be familiarity. It's quite a lot for a newish teacher to take on board when teaching a program of this magnitude for the first time. And it may well be that teachers need a couple of runs through before they're really familiar with all of the components of the course, and they're just getting their head around preparing next week's lessons. So we've seen real variability from very, very high take up to quite low.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephen. I have got a question for Brooke here. If Brooke's still there.
Yes, sorry.
Yes. So Brooke, in the first 2 5-week blocks of your CET course, are the academic skills assessed at all? If not, is the issue of student disengagement significant in your experience?
No. To the issue of student disengagement, what we've actually had, we've only had this model in place for probably, I don't know, 18 months now or so. And what we are actually getting back from that, from student and teacher feedback, is the students tend to tell us that they find those first 2 modules incredibly valuable, that they learn so much, they learn academic language, they're learning how to operate in an academic context. And when they get to that testing module at the end, they feel a bit disappointed and like they're not learning so much anymore. It's just testing, and they've had years of testing, if you like. We do run assessments in those academic skills modules, and the assessments are the same, not the same, because they're more about extended written tasks, but we use the same kind of rubric to assess those. So in that sense, yes, we are aiming to capture some of those academic skills in the assessment.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brooke.
Sorry, Will, I'm just going to jump in here. If you could just, Will, Brooke and Stephen, just when you're not talking, mute your mics, just so we don't get any interference.
Okay, no problem, Sophie. Another question for Brooke here. Could you please explain a little how you standardise teachers' approach to teaching, I assume in the first 10 weeks, and also with assessment?
Standardising the approach to teaching, is that the question?
So I assume that questioner means how do you assume teachers are teaching the same material or developing the same skills in roughly the same way? You must have a number of different classes.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we have huge amounts of students. I think it's a process of, first of all, I mean, the course is blended. So what the teachers, there's activities that the students need to do online prior to or post the class, and if the students have not completed those tasks, then it's going to impact on what the teacher is doing in class. And this sort of flow in and out of the activities that we've structured in there tends to keep people on the same track. The other thing that we have here is really that the assumption is that you're delivering the course content as it is in the book and as it is on the we use Canvas on the Canvas platform. We have weekly meetings where we go through what's expected for the week day by day and talk through the outcomes for the teachers and what the activities are going to be, and teachers can ask questions and feedback there. Teachers also share classes, and we try and pair up for them as far as possible more experienced teachers with the perhaps less experienced teachers, and they're able to support each other and keep each other on track in that way. And we don't actually find that it's a problem in terms of teachers going off and doing their own thing, though I do think that teachers need some flexibility in terms of being able to adapt for the needs of their class. In regard to things like referencing conventions, for example, we've come up with 3 basic principles for referencing that seem to hold across the disciplines based on our research into that. And so we just teach the students that to approach referencing in that way and make it very clear to them that, for example, when they get to their disciplines, there might be different referencing conventions and that they'll have to learn the conventions when they get there. The teachers know that, for example, so they know the humanities teachers are not then going to go off and teach to, for example, engineering and science students practices that are not necessarily appropriate within their context. So we try and keep it the same in that way. In regard to standardising, I think the other half of the question was standardising teachers around marking of assessments. Was that correct, Will?
Yeah, that's right.
We run larger group standardisation before any of the integrated tasks. So the materials are sent out to teachers. They're asked to look at that when they come to a teachers meeting. That's all done together as a whole group type standardisation. Then again, immediately prior to each assessment task, a different set of materials is usually sent out. We have marking teams which consist of about usually 3 to 4 teachers. And we have marking team leaders who are some of our more experienced teachers. So the marking team leader will choose 1 or 2 scripts from any of those 4 classes that belong to those 3 or 4 teachers, distribute them to the team. Each of the team will mark them, and then the marking team leader is responsible for organising a short meeting where they can all get together and make sure they're on the same page or not. If there's any significant disagreement about that, that is then referred back to our assessment working group, whose job it is to set the standard in terms of marking and assessment. And so we sort of go through that process, particularly at the higher stakes end of the course, with all the productive skills assessment tasks.
Great, thanks, Brooke. We've actually got quite a few questions here, but we've just gone over the hour, so I think we might have to wrap it up. What I might do is post these questions on the LinkedIn group, and maybe Brooke and Stephen, if you get a chance later on, you could go on there and post a quick response. But yeah, on behalf of everyone who attended the webinar, I'd like to thank you both for your efforts in putting together your presentations and sharing your context with us. I know I certainly found it really interesting to look at those 2 approaches. Again, you know, we work in a university context and it's a slightly different approach we take again. So yeah, really interesting and appreciate your time. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Brooke.
See you later, guys.
Bye-bye.